My job is to introduce Mark Diesendorf, and it's really my great pleasure because I've actually known Mark for over 20 years. He doesn't know that, but when I attended climate conferences, when I attended seminars about the environment, I had the opportunity over 20 years ago to listen to Mark, and that was really important for me because it gave me an understanding about the really serious environmental issues that I have really spent a lot of time working and activating, being an activist for. So Mark is an esteemed academic. He's not coming here just to talk about anything. He's been done years and years of research from his academic career, and he's been warning us for decades that the way we're doing things is not the way to do it because the planet is really hemorrhaging, seriously hemorrhaging with climate, with ecological collapse, with deforestation, with resource depletion. And the thing about having boundaries, physics boundaries, that when you break them and you go beyond them, we can't go back. So he's been a really timely person to tell us about these crises. He's also committed to peace and is deeply concerned about the escalation and threats that we are facing as a modern world, and as even with the issue of nuclear threats that is just rearing itself, and we are now looking at a world that is really imploding, military with terrible consequences of war that is killing, thousands and thousands of people. Mark's really thinking about these questions. He's thinking about how do we solve these problems. And he's looking at things like the economy, the way we've structured the economy over the last 30 years. And that resonates to me very strongly because when I was a young teacher, and I did go at certain meetings, I can remember people saying, we live in a society, not an economy. And yet now really the dominant view is that everything is seen through the lens of an economy and not about a society. Mark is a member of ABC Friends. He is a friend of the ABC. But he's also here to say some tough love to the ABC about how it must be fearless, it must be independent, and it must be a formidable champion of the public interest. So we're going to have a very interesting view, and there will be an opportunity for everyone to think of questions so that we can have a very lively discussion at the end. So welcome, Mark. We're really delighted you're here.
Well, thank you very much, Janine, for that wonderful introduction. I feel that probably I don't need to give my talk now. And usually I sit in one of those seats and enjoy the talk and especially enjoy the lunch. So I'll try not to keep you too long. But today's topic is actually a controversial and important one. It's democracy. And it's not... I guess I want to say first is that we're going to go beneath the conventional view that democracy is simply something about elections every 3 or 4 years, and if we go a little deeper, the separation of powers that we need to have between the executive of government, the parliament, and the judiciary. And incidentally, that separation has almost been totally lost in the United States. So, and I'd like to discuss what the ABC could do to help make democracy function better, because democracy is under threat all over the world right now, including here in Australia, although it's not threatened quite as much as in the United States. Now, we know that democracy only works well when its citizens are well informed about the issues that confront us, and then we can choose our representatives and we can represent our concerns to them between elections. So the mass media plays a vital role in informing us about issues that confront us, and for democracy to work and for fascism to be kept at bay, we have to have an independent media. And of course, as you know, most of our media is commercial media. It's far from independent. So we depend very much on the ABC. Now, in the United States, Trump has bullied most of the mass media into conforming to what he once said or into silence. And for the remaining parts of the mass media there, some of his billionaire mates have bought them up and kept them quiet in that way. Now, propaganda and the assault on truth is one of the 10 characteristics of fascism that have been set out by historian and author Rutger Bregman. Bregman argues that nowadays the United States satisfies all 10 characteristics of fascism, and he has given an excellent talk comparing Nazi Germany and the United States of today for all 10 criteria. And that's pretty scary, and that sort of thing isn't normally spoken of in the mass media here. And I would wonder whether even our beloved ABC would dare to broadcast a program debating the issue as to whether the United States is now a fascist state. So our ABC is one of two members of the mass media that's nominally independent of vested interests. If it fails us, then we're left to The Guardian, and I'm not sure what its circulation is, and several small independent media in Australia, which are very good but have small readership, like Pearls and Irritations, Michael West, Independent Australia, Crikey, Inside Story, and there are a few others. Now, in taking an adult approach to democracy, we have to recognise that democracy is continuously threatened by vested interests, often very politically powerful vested interests. And these interests pressure governments, the oppositions, the public service, and the mass media to put across the misinformation and disinformation that they want put across. And when these pressures actually work in a particular area, whether it's climate change or gambling or urban development, when they work, we say that we're in a situation of state capture of the nation state by powerful vested interests. Now, state capture is a much more powerful and far-reaching form of corruption than when a representative of industry pays a little bit of money across to a politician to get a contract or something like that. State capture is all-embracing, really. It's a stranglehold on our society in particular areas. There is a weaker version of state capture that if you go onto ChatGPT and you look up state capture, it'll mainly give you regulatory capture, which is not such a powerful state of capture. It's when there's a close, unhealthy relationship that develops between a vested interest and a particular government department or agency that's supposed to regulate it. State capture goes beyond that. Now, what about the captors? Those who exercise state capture? Well, they're mostly industries, but they can also be criminal organisations, professional organisations, religious organisations, or foreign governments. What are the methods of state capture? I'm sure you know many of them, so I'll just remind you, of course, political donations and election expenditure is a very big method of capturing major political parties. Lobbying behind the scenes, revolving door jobs between ministers and ministerial advisors on one hand and the vested interests on the other hand. So-called think tanks, like the Institute of Public Affairs, into which Gina Reinhardt, our richest person in Australia, has poured millions of dollars, and the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. Consultancies to government is another method of state capture. And in some cases, not so much in Australia, bribery, blackmail, and physical intimidation. Okay, so state capture is big and strong. And in my latest book, The Path to a Sustainable Civilization, and the latest peer-reviewed article, I argue that state capture is in fact...
Just move this up a little bit for you, sorry.
Thank you. Is in fact the principal driving force of several existential threats that we face and several other major threats to human civilization. And these include human-induced climate change, of course, and the broader destruction of our life support system, the natural environment, due to corporate greed operating in an economic system that fosters that greed. And war, of course, that could easily become nuclear war, with US bases in Australia making us the first targets, possibly. And then we face the increasing gap between rich and poor. And it really is increasing here in the United States and in many other countries, demonstrated by large gaps in wealth and income and the housing crisis in Australia. We also have, in New South Wales especially, an erosion of the right to protest, an erosion of worker rights, and an erosion of cultural and educational institutions that practice, or supposed to practice, free speech. So clearly, state capture threatens the existence of civilization, but it's also, by definition, a major threat to democracy. When vested interests effectively make the decisions, when they determine media reports and opinion, the arts, public attitudes and government policies, then democracy and public interest suffer. Yet state capture is rarely exposed and analysed in the mass media. Now, our ABC has a mixed record on state capture. It did really well to publicise the excellent report on state capture published by the Australian Democracy Network back in 2022. And since then, it's done a few things that are really impressive in this area. It's news investigation on regulatory capture by the gambling industry. The ABC's been very strong on that. And of course, many of you will have seen the recent Four Corners program called Campus Chaos, which investigated claims that private consultancy firms were responsible for sweeping restructures of universities and cuts to courses. So perhaps it's not exactly state capture, but it's certainly capture of our universities by consultancies. So far, the ABC's record is not too bad, but it really could and should do more. Like the rest of the mainstream media, the ABC has really failed to discuss the methods of state capture and expose them so that they can be addressed, except for the question of political donations and election expenditure, which has been in the media because of the coalition between the present government and the coalition to pass legislation to make it more difficult for minor parties and independents to get elected. So I'm offering my comments as a friend of the ABC, but I wish to encourage the ABC to serve democracy even better than it is at present. Many years ago, the ABC started to give much airtime to campaigners against climate action and renewable energy, who had no appropriate scientific qualifications, or even any qualifications. Now, fortunately, over time, the ABC has come to realise that balance in presenting does not mean giving equal time to anti-science and science. So despite that questionable start, I think the ABC has done very well on educating the public about climate change, but less well on the role of the fossil fuel industry as a vested interest that strongly influences government policy, whichever party is in government. and it's given little airtime to the analysis of methods used by the industry to gain political power. It also hasn't discussed a major factor slowing climate mitigation and threatening the environment. And this is almost unknown in Australia until recently. The rise of data centres raised it. And that is that while renewable energy is growing in Australia fantastically well and performing really well, so is energy consumption growing at the same time. And the result is that renewable energy is chasing after growing energy consumption. The result of that means that through no fault of renewable energy, it's pretty well almost impossible for renewable energy to replace all fossil fuels in Australia before 2050. And on a world scale, it's certainly impossible. So the problem isn't renewable energy. The problem is the growth in consumption of energy, and that is driven by the growth in economic consumption. So already, as someone whose research grew up within the energy sector, I have to start thinking about the economic system. Well, anyway, independent researchers, including myself, drew attention to this problem quite a few years ago in the peer-reviewed literature. But when our university, the University of New South Wales, issued a press release, none of the mass media actually mentioned it, including the ABC. We did manage to get coverage by publishing an article in Pearls and Irritations and also in The Conversation. Oh, it's the same article, actually. So we have to now look at economic growth in the rich countries. And, of course, that's driven by believers in conventional economics. My apologies to any economists in the audience. Together with big business, which employs psychologists to design advertising and lobbyists to influence political decision-making. And this generally overrides protection of the environment and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, the excessive emphasis on gross domestic product, GDP, ignores the gap between the rich and poor, ignores the value of unpaid work, especially that of women, and ignores the environmental impacts of economic activities. The dominant economic system, in particular neoliberalism, is based on ideology and appallingly bad science. And I say that as a scientist who, along with other sustainability scientists, have for many years now been investigating economics, neoclassical economics, and the theory is just mostly nonsense. Nevertheless, it has captured governments and oppositions and public service and the mass media, including our ABC. Supporters of neoliberalism fill the mass media and the social media and economics courses in secondary schools and universities with economic ideologies and myths. And these myths do not stand up to scientific examination. I'll just list three, but there are many more on my website if you want to look, markdiesendorf.com. So one myth is one I've already touched on, the myth that endless growth on a finite planet is feasible and in fact desirable. Another myth is that wealth trickles down from the rich to the poor. Give tax deductions to the rich, the myth says, and everyone will benefit. Well, there have been empirical studies that absolutely refute this across all the OECD countries. And another myth is, of course, that GDP is a measure of well-being. It's nothing of the sort. When somebody does manage to publish a critique or an alternative view that actually receives publicity, the full weight of these vested interests descends upon them. When our Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, introduced the modest concept of a well-being economy that should be measured by a wide range of indicators, the Murdoch press and the Australian Financial Review attacked him fiercely. So I would like to see the ABC allowing more debate about these economic myths from people who have often studied them scientifically. Now, the challenge to the ABC becomes even more serious when the nation state is captured by a foreign government. Since the end of World War II, every Australian government, Labor or coalition, bar one, has been subservient to the United States government in foreign affairs and defence. Presumably, this is due to the false notions that, one, Australia is still just a European oasis in an Asian sea, and two, that the US will protect us if we are attacked. Now, it's been clear for a long time that that was never the case. One of the few virtues of Trump is that he's actually making it positively clear. So the state capture of Australia by the US military-industrial complex has been reinforced by several methods. When our ABC interviews a so-called expert on foreign affairs and defence, it often chooses a representative of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. But it omits to inform us that ASPI has a conflict of interest. It is funded by the United States government as well as the Australian government and by the weapons industry. It is not an objective source, and our ABC should be saying that. When retiring ministers of defence of both major parties walk into highly paid jobs in the weapons industry, there is a conflict of interest there. I refuse to use the phrase potential conflict of interest. It is a conflict of interest by definition. Does the ABC have a comment on such things? Before the Australian government's decision to join AUKUS, we now know that our Department of Defence employed as consultants a gang of 6 United States retired admirals and senior US public servants to advise it. This raises the question, was joining AUKUS really our government's decision or the US government's? The US consultants were exposed, not by any of the mass media in Australia, but by investigative reporters of the Washington Post. And that was before billionaire Jeff Bezos decimated the Washington Post. Australia and our ABC appear to be captured on Middle East policy by Israel and the United States. The ABC's unlawful termination of Antoinette Lattouf is just the tip of the iceberg. The judge in Ms. Lattouf's legal case for wrongful dismissal found that she was dismissed because, and I quote, she held a political opinion opposing the Israeli military campaign in Gaza, unquote. The judge also found that the ABC's decision was made to appease pro-Israel lobbyists. This is the judge's decision speaking. In 2025, a YouGov poll commissioned by the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network found that the majority of Australians support sanctions on Israel over its ruthless campaign in Gaza. The majority of Australians. The poll was reported by Guardian Australia and even briefly by Sky News, but not by our ABC, I'm sad to say. This is worrying. I found that if I wish to receive a wide range of expert analysis on the conflicts in the Middle East, I have to read, for starters, The Guardian, the English version of the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, reports by the United Nations, and Australia's own Pearls and Irritations. I have to watch podcast videos broadcast by overseas groups, independent overseas groups such as Democracy Now!, The Intercept, and Neutrality Studies, and by journalists such as Owen Jones, who does write for The Guardian, and Chris Hedges. These sources interview eminent commentators such as Francesca Albanese, Yanis Varoufakis, and Jeffrey Sachs. I watch interviews with Jewish historians and political scientists who are bravely critical of Israel's genocide. Such scholars as Ilan Pape, Omer Bartov, Avi Schlein, and Norman Finkelstein. These last 4 Jewish scholars are rarely interviewed by the ABC, never on TV. Of the 4, only Pape was interviewed more recently than October 2023. and the others were interviewed in October 2023, but silenced since then. So it seems that the Israeli lobby has been effective in excluding from the ABC interviews of almost all eminent critics of Israel's policies and actions. Okay, just one more. In several years, the ABC has referred to and still refers to, quote, Israel's war against Hamas, unquote, and, quote, Israel's war against Hezbollah. But is this appropriate, or is it the unthinking adoption of propaganda by the ABC? After all, Israel has destroyed or severely damaged almost all housing and infrastructure in Gaza and is attempting to herd 2 million Palestinians into what amounts to a concentration camp. Is that a war against Hamas, or a deliberate strategy to destroy any possibility of a two-state solution? Is Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon, which is proceeding apace, and the deliberate destruction of infrastructure across Lebanon just a war against Hezbollah or a land grab? If the ABC permitted independent overseas experts that I mentioned to be interviewed nowadays, then listeners and viewers could consider an alternative story to Israel's, namely that Israel, backed by the United States, is following a deliberate policy to capture and rule all of Palestine, from the river to the sea and beyond, and to turn all of Israel's neighbouring countries into failed states. They've already succeeded in Gaza, the West Bank, Iraq, Syria, Libya and Lebanon. Iran is being severely bombed right now, and some Israeli politicians are already saying that Turkey is next on the list. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the ABC should present this story as the only account. I am saying that the ABC should allow its listeners to hear both Israel's story and the alternative stories by experts, and allow listeners to make their own decisions. So to conclude, if we wish to live in a genuine democracy, we must expose and challenge state capture by vested interests and its methods of gaining political power. Whether these interests are the fossil fuel or the gambling industry, the conventional economics profession, the military-industrial complex, or foreign governments. Thank you very much.